December 15, 1944. The transport truck rattled to a stop outside Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and 42 German women stepped into air so thick with humidity it felt like breathing through wet cloth. They had traveled for 3 weeks from the port in New York, these women of the Wehrmacht's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final Allied push through France. Now they stood in a land so foreign it might as well have been another planet. Anneliese Waldman was 24 years old, though she felt ancient. Her gray auxiliary uniform hung loose on a frame that had shed 15 pounds since her capture. The daughter of a Hamburg shipping clerk, she had joined the Women's Corps in 1942 as a radio operator, believing the propaganda about defending the fatherland. That belief had died somewhere between the Allied bombardment at Caen and the moment American soldiers took her into custody with surprising gentleness. The camp's commanding officer, Major William Harrison, stood waiting with an interpreter. He was a tall man with kind eyes that seemed out of place in a military uniform. When he addressed them through the interpreter, his words carried none of the harshness they had been taught to expect from their enemies. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention," he said. "You will be treated with dignity and respect. You will work, you will follow rules, and you will be safe. Safe." The word hung in the air like something Anneliese had forgotten existed. For 2 years, safety had been a concept from childhood, before the bombs, before the rationing, before the desperate final months when German cities burned and the Reich's promises turned to ash. The women were led to their barracks, a simple wooden structure with rows of cots that looked like luxury compared to the cramped transport ships. But it was the mess hall that would change everything. That first evening, as the December sun painted the Mississippi sky in shades of orange and pink, the German women filed into the dining facility and stopped dead in their tracks. The tables were set with real plates, not tin cups. The serving line offered portions that seemed impossibly large. There was bread, white bread, not the sawdust mixture they had choked down in Germany's final years. There was butter, actual butter, golden and rich. There were vegetables that looked fresh rather than preserved. And there was meat, more meat than most of them had seen in months. Hildegard Schroeder, a former nurse from Bremen, stood frozen with her tray. Her hands trembled so violently that Elfriede Becker, a clerk from Lübeck, steadied her elbow. Around them, the other women moved through the line in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. This was enemy captivity. This was supposed to be punishment, yet here was abundance beyond anything they had known even before the war. Anneliese took her seat at one of the long tables and stared at her plate. The American guards watched them with curious expressions, perhaps wondering why their prisoners looked ready to weep over a simple meal. The Christmas season arrived at Camp Shelby with a warmth that felt wrong to women accustomed to cold German winters. Palm trees stood where fir trees should have been, and the air carried the scent of magnolias instead of snow. The German women had settled into routines over the past 2 weeks, working in the camp laundry, assisting in administrative duties, and trying to make sense of their new reality. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall had been decorated with paper chains and handmade ornaments. Major Harrison had allowed the women to sing German carols, a gesture that brought tears to eyes that had remained dry through capture and transport. But it was what happened after dinner that would become legend among the prisoners. The camp cooks wheeled out trays of dessert, and the women stared in confusion at the small brown squares arranged on plates. Chocolate was a memory from before the war, a luxury that had disappeared from German life years ago. But this was something different, something they had never encountered. Corporal James Mitchell, a farm boy from Iowa with a gentle smile, noticed their hesitation. He picked up one of the squares and took a bite, gesturing for them to do the same. "That's fudge," he said slowly, pointing to the dessert. "American fudge, Christmas treat." Anneliese lifted the small square to her nose. The smell was overwhelming, rich, and sweet and utterly foreign. She touched it to her lips, then took the smallest bite. The texture was unlike anything she had experienced, smooth and dense, melting on her tongue with a sweetness so intense it was almost painful. Sugar, real sugar, chocolate, cream, things that existed only in childhood memories. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions. Hildegard closed her eyes as she chewed, a single tear running down her cheek. Elfrida stared at the remaining piece in her hand as if it might disappear. Some of the younger women actually gasped, their faces showing pure astonishment. But what happened next surprised even the American guards. Instead of finishing their portions, many of the women carefully wrapped the remaining fudge in napkins. Annalisa watched as Hildegard slipped a piece into her uniform pocket with trembling fingers. Elfrida did the same, glancing around nervously as if expecting to be punished for this act. Annalisa looked down at her own half-eaten square. In Germany, hoarding food was survival. Ration cards determined who ate and who went hungry. Her mother had taught her to save every crumb, to hide small amounts against future deprivation. Even here, in this place of impossible abundance, the instinct remained. She folded the napkin around the fudge and tucked it carefully into her pocket, feeling the slight weight against her hip. It was evidence, proof that this moment was real, that such sweetness existed in the world. In the morning, she could touch it and know she hadn't dreamed this strange American Christmas. Corporal Mitchell noticed, but said nothing. He simply nodded slightly, understanding something deeper than language could express. Annalisa Waldmann had never imagined her life would lead to a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi. Born in Hamburg in 1920, she had grown up watching ships come and go from the harbor, her father working as a clerk in the shipping offices. She had been a clever student with an aptitude for mathematics and codes, skills that made her valuable when the Wehrmacht began recruiting women for auxiliary positions. In 1942, joining had seemed patriotic, even exciting. She would serve as a radio operator, they told her. She would help coordinate communications, support the troops, defend the fatherland. The reality had been far less glamorous. Long hours in cramped quarters, intercepting Allied transmissions, watching the war turn against Germany month by month. When the Americans captured her unit outside Caen, she had felt relief more than fear. Hildegard Schroeder's path had been different. At 28, she was the oldest of the three women who had formed an unlikely friendship in the camp. A trained nurse from Bremen, she had volunteered for the medical corps, believing she could save lives rather than take them. She had seen things in field hospitals that still haunted her dreams. Young men dying from wounds that proper supplies might have treated. Civilians caught in crossfire. The gradual collapse of any pretense that this war was noble or just. She had been captured while evacuating wounded soldiers from a field hospital in Belgium. The American medics who took her into custody had treated her with professional courtesy, even respect. One had looked at her blood-stained uniform and said simply, "War's hard on everyone." Those words had stayed with her. Elfrida Becker was the youngest at 22, a clerk from Lübeck who had processed paperwork for Wehrmacht logistics. She had never fired a weapon, never seen combat directly, but she had watched the numbers tell their own story. Fewer supplies moving east, more casualty reports coming back. The mathematical evidence of Germany's defeat had been clear in the files long before anyone admitted it aloud. Her capture had been almost anticlimactic. The office where she worked had simply been overrun by American forces one autumn morning. She had sat at her desk, hands raised, while soldiers secured the building. One of them had offered her coffee from his canteen. Real coffee. She had almost wept. Now these three women from northern Germany sat together in the Camp Shelby mess hall, sharing their evening meal and speaking in low German voices about everything and nothing. They talked about the weather, so different from home. They talked about the work assignments, the strange kindness of the guards, the impossible abundance of the food. What they didn't talk about was the future. What they didn't mention was the fudge hidden in their pockets, growing slightly soft in the Mississippi heat. What they couldn't yet articulate was the growing realization that captivity in America might offer something they had lost long ago in Germany. Hope. Corporal James Mitchell had grown up on an Iowa farm where his family raised hogs and corn. He understood scarcity in the way any farmer did, the anxiety of hoping for rain, the careful rationing of seed for next year's planting. But he had never known real hunger, never experienced the kind of deprivation that made a person hide food even when surrounded by plenty. Watching the German women slip fudge into their pockets had troubled him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He mentioned it to Sergeant Robert Palmer during their rounds the next morning. "They're hoarding the desserts," he said, "hiding pieces in their uniforms. Should we say something?" Palmer, a school teacher from Connecticut before the war, thought for a moment. "What were German rations like by the end?" he asked. Mitchell shrugged. "Bad, I'd guess. Everything was bad over there." Palmer nodded slowly. "Worse than bad." "I read the intelligence reports. They were eating sawdust bread, turnip soup, whatever they could find. Some cities were starving. These women probably haven't seen real sugar in years." The observation shifted something in Mitchell's understanding. He began watching the prisoners more carefully, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. He noticed how they ate slowly, savoring each bite, how they never left anything on their plates, even vegetables they clearly didn't enjoy, how their eyes tracked the food cart when it rolled through the mess hall, following it with an intensity that spoke of old fears. That evening, he approached Major Harrison with an idea. "Sir, what if we let them have extra dessert? Not as a reward, just as something they can keep." The major raised an eyebrow. "Explain your thinking, Corporal." Mitchell chose his words carefully. "They're hoarding because they don't trust that there will be more tomorrow. If we show them there's always enough, maybe they'll stop feeling like they have to hide it." Major Harrison considered this. The camp had plenty of supplies. The American military machine produced abundance that would have seemed miraculous to their enemies. Sugar, chocolate, coffee, all the things that had disappeared from European markets years ago. "And what exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Mitchell outlined his idea. "Let the cooks make extra fudge, put out bowls of hard candy. Make it clear that sweets aren't scarce here, that wanting seconds isn't shameful." Major Harrison studied the young corporal for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it. But make sure they understand it's not charity, it's just how things are done here." The next day, bowls of peppermint candies appeared on the mess hall tables. The German women approached them cautiously, unsure if taking one would bring punishment. Corporal Mitchell made a show of taking a candy himself, unwrapping it and popping it in his mouth. He gestured to the women. "For everyone," he said in his halting German, "not special, normal." Annalise was the first to reach out. Her fingers closed around a striped candy, and she looked up at Mitchell with something approaching wonder in her eyes. The peppermint candies became a bridge between two languages, two worlds, two groups of people who were supposed to be enemies. Within days, the mess hall transformed from a place of silent consumption into something approaching community. Corporal Mitchell began teaching the women English words for the foods they encountered, pointing to items and pronouncing them slowly while the prisoners repeated after him: apple pie, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread. Each phrase was an invitation into American culture, a small act of inclusion that went far beyond basic vocabulary lessons. Annalise proved to have the best ear for English, her radio operator training giving her an advantage with sounds and patterns. She became an informal translator, helping bridge the gap when gestures and pointing failed. The kitchen staff, initially uncertain about their new charges, found themselves drawn into these exchanges. Private Thomas Washington, a cook from Alabama, began saving extra portions of dessert for the women who worked kitchen duty. He showed Hildegard how to make biscuits, his large hands demonstrating the technique of cutting butter into flour, while she watched with the intensity of someone learning vital survival skills. Sergeant Palmer started bringing newspapers to the mess hall during evening meals, reading simple headlines aloud and explaining American phrases. The women listened with fierce concentration, understanding perhaps one word in 5, but absorbing the rhythm of the language. Elfrida kept a small notebook where she wrote down new words, her clerk's training making her meticulous about spelling even when she wasn't sure of meanings. But it was the continued presence of sweets that revealed the deepest transformation. Major Harrison had ordered the kitchen to maintain the bowls of candy and to serve dessert with every evening meal. At first, the German women continued their hoarding, pockets bulging with wrapped candies and carefully folded napkins containing cake or cookies. But gradually, as days turned to weeks and the abundance never faltered, something shifted. Annalisa was the first to stop hiding food. She sat at the table one evening in early January, eating her piece of chocolate cake slowly, savoring each bite, but finishing the entire portion without saving any. Hildegard noticed and followed suit the next day. Elfrida took longer, her survival instincts harder to overcome, but eventually she too began eating her full portions. The Americans noticed this change and understood its significance. These women were learning to trust that tomorrow would bring more food, that abundance wasn't a temporary illusion, but a permanent state. Corporal Mitchell felt something loosen in his chest when he saw Annalisa laugh at her own mispronunciation of butterscotch, her face open and unguarded for the first time since her arrival. The mess hall had become more than a place to eat. It had become a space where former enemies discovered they could share not just food, but language, laughter, and the small kindnesses that remind people of their common humanity. In that room, with its long tables and bowls of candy, the war felt very far away. February brought news from Europe that shattered the fragile peace the women had constructed in Camp Shelby. The Allied advance into Germany accelerated, and with it came reports that filtered through official channels and found their way into American newspapers. Sergeant Palmer, still conducting his informal English lessons, hesitated before bringing the latest papers to the mess hall. These women needed to know what was happening to their homeland, but the knowledge would wound them deeply. Hamburg had been bombed again, massive raids that left the port city in ruins. Bremen suffered similar devastation. Lübeck, the medieval jewel of the Baltic coast, had been reduced to rubble months earlier. The cities these women called home were being systematically destroyed, and they could do nothing but read about it in a foreign language in a land thousands of miles away. Annalisa sat in the camp library, an American newspaper spread before her. Her English had improved enough to understand the essential facts. Hamburg, firestorm, thousands dead, neighborhoods obliterated. She thought of her parents' apartment near the harbor, the view of ships her father had loved. She hadn't received word from them since before her capture. The Red Cross had promised to help locate family members, but the chaos in Germany made such searches nearly impossible. Hildegard received the only letter any of them had gotten from home, and the news it contained was devastating. Her younger sister, a nurse like herself, had been killed in an air raid on Bremen in December. The letter had taken 2 months to reach her, which meant she had been singing Christmas carols in the Camp Shelby mess hall on the very day her sister died. The knowledge felt like a betrayal, as if her moment of peace had somehow caused the tragedy. She showed the letter to Annalise and Elfrida, her hands shaking. The paper was thin, nearly transparent, covered in her mother's cramped handwriting. Between the lines of grief, her mother had written something that haunted Hildegard more than the news of death. There is nothing left here. The city is gone. Food is scarce. People are dying not from bombs, but from hunger and cold. If you can stay where you are, stay. There is nothing to come home to. Elfrida had no letters at all. Her parents in Lübeck had vanished into the silence that swallowed so many German families during the war's final months. She wrote letter after letter through the Red Cross, addressing them to their last known location, but nothing came back. Not confirmation of receipt, not notification of death, just empty silence that felt worse than any definitive news. The three women sat together in the barracks that night, speaking in quiet German, while around them other prisoners dealt with their own grief and uncertainty. "We have more here than they have at home," Annalisa said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt like treason, an admission of something shameful, but they were true. In Camp Shelby, they ate 3 meals a day. They had warm beds and working plumbing. They had safety from bombs and access to medical care. They had bowls of candy on tables and the kindness of men like Corporal Mitchell, who brought them extra blankets when the nights grew cool. Corporal Mitchell found the piece of fudge in the laundry room on a mild February morning. It had fallen from someone's pocket during the wash, wrapped in a napkin that had somehow survived the water. The chocolate had melted and reformed into a misshapen lump, barely recognizable but carefully preserved nonetheless. He held it in his palm, this small artifact of survival instinct, and finally understood what the hoarding really meant. It wasn't about hunger. These women weren't starving anymore. They had gained weight since their arrival, their faces filling out, their movements growing less tentative. The hoarding continued not because they needed the food, but because they needed the proof. Proof that sweetness existed. Proof that abundance was real. Proof that this strange captivity wasn't a dream they would wake from to find themselves back in the deprivation of wartime Germany. He brought the melted fudge to Sergeant Palmer, who examined it with the thoughtful expression he often wore during their discussions about the prisoners. "It's a talisman," Palmer said finally, "like soldiers carrying photos or good luck charms. They're not saving it to eat. They're saving it to remember that someone cared enough to give them something precious." Major Harrison called a meeting with his senior staff to discuss what they had learned about their prisoners over the past 3 months. These women had been conditioned by years of scarcity to distrust abundance, to save against inevitable deprivation, to protect themselves against a future that had always brought less rather than more. The Americans had shown them a different reality, but changing deeply ingrained survival behaviors took more than a few weeks of good meals. In the barracks, Annalise kept her original piece of Christmas fudge in a small cloth bag under her pillow. It had long since dried out, becoming hard and probably inedible, but she touched it each night before sleeping. The gesture had become ritual, a way of grounding herself in the strange new world she inhabited. This small square of chocolate represented everything that had changed since her capture. It was physical evidence that her enemies had treated her with unexpected humanity. Hildegard had started a collection, small wrapped candies lined up on her footlocker in neat rows, organized by color. She never ate them. Instead, she looked at them each morning and evening, counting them like prayer beads. When other women asked why she kept them, she struggled to explain in words what the candies meant. They reminded her that there could be sweetness in the world even during the darkest times. They proved that kindness wasn't just a memory from before the war, but something that could still exist between enemies. Elfrida had taken to writing descriptions of American foods in her notebook alongside her English vocabulary. "Fudge," she wrote in careful script, "smooth and sweet, tastes like chocolate and cream together, melts on the tongue." She included details about texture and flavor, as if documenting something scientific, as if precision could help her believe this abundance was real. The American staff began to recognize these behaviors not as signs of distrust but as evidence of healing. The women were learning to hold on to hope, to preserve moments of kindness against future uncertainty. They were building new survival skills for a world that might offer sweetness alongside suffering. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The news reached Camp Shelby through radio broadcasts that crackled with static and excitement. In towns across America, people danced in the streets and kissed strangers. Church bells rang. Soldiers cheered. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. In the women's barracks at Camp Shelby, the atmosphere was not celebratory. The 42 German prisoners sat in silence, understanding that their strange limbo was ending. Major Harrison had called an assembly for the following morning to discuss repatriation procedures. The word hung over them like a sentence waiting to be carried out. Repatriation, return, going back to a Germany that no longer existed in any form they would recognize. Anneliese couldn't sleep that night. She lay on her cot, touching the dried piece of fudge under her pillow, trying to imagine stepping off a ship in Hamburg. Would her parents still be alive? Would their apartment still be standing? The reports from Germany painted a picture of complete devastation. Cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, millions dead or displaced, starvation widespread. The occupation divided between 4 powers, each section operating under different rules. Hildegard sat on her footlocker, looking at her collection of candies in the dim barracks light. Her mother's letter had been clear. There is nothing to come home to. But could she simply choose not to return? Was that even possible? She was a prisoner of war, not an immigrant. The Geneva Convention governed her status. She would be, sent back whether she wished it or not. Or would she? Elfriede had been asking questions, her clerk's mind seeking information about regulations and procedures. She had learned that the chaos in Germany was delaying repatriation for many prisoners. The logistics of moving thousands of people back to a country with destroyed ports and railways made the process slow and complicated. Some prisoners might remain in American custody for months longer. And what happened after that? Could someone simply refuse to board the ship? The morning assembly brought Major Harrison's formal announcement. "Ladies," he said through the interpreter, "the war in Europe has ended. We will begin processing your repatriation over the coming weeks. You will be transported to New York and from there to ships bound for Germany." He paused, his kind eyes scanning the rows of women before him. "I want you to know that your conduct here has been exemplary. You have worked hard and shown dignity throughout your captivity." Then he said something that changed everything. "If any of you face special circumstances that might delay your repatriation, if you have concerns about your safety or the situation you would return to, please speak with me or Sergeant Palmer privately. We cannot make promises, but we will listen." The words were carefully chosen, leaving space for possibility without making explicit offers. Anneliese felt her heart racing. She looked at Hildegard, who looked at Elfriede. The same question was written on all 3 faces. Could they ask to stay? Would the Americans even consider such a request? That evening, the 3 women sat together in the mess hall long after the other prisoners had returned to the barracks. Before them sat their dinner plates, empty except for the dessert chocolate cake with vanilla frosting. For the first time in months, none of them moved to save a piece. Anneliese Waldmann stood before Major Harrison's desk 3 days after the announcement, her hands clasped tightly to stop their trembling. Beside her stood Hildegard and Elfriede, the 3 women having decided they would make their request together. Corporal Mitchell and Sergeant Palmer were present as witnesses, their faces carefully neutral. Major Harrison gestured for them to sit. Anneliese had prepared a speech in English, practicing the words until her pronunciation was clear. "Major Harrison, we wish to request permission to delay our repatriation." She paused, gathering courage. "We have no homes to return to. Our families are dead or missing. Germany is destroyed. Here we have found safety and kindness. We wish to stay in America, if that is possible." The major listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "What you're asking," he said slowly, "is complicated. You are prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention requires your repatriation. However," he continued, "the situation in Germany is chaotic. The displaced persons, Situation is unprecedented. There may be ways to reclassify your status if you can find American sponsors willing to vouch for you. Sponsors? Hildegard asked, her English less confident than Annalise's. Major Harrison nodded. American citizens who would take responsibility for you, help you find work and housing, guarantee that you won't become public charges. It's a long process, and there are no guarantees, but it's not impossible. Over the following weeks, something remarkable happened. The American staff at Camp Shelby became advocates for the three women. Corporal Mitchell wrote to his family in Iowa, asking if they might sponsor Elfrida. His parents, moved by his descriptions of the young German clerk who had shown such genuine remorse for her country's actions, agreed to help. Sergeant Palmer contacted colleagues at the school where he had taught in Connecticut, and they began organizing sponsorship for Annalise. A local family, the Thorntons, who had visited the camp as part of a church outreach program, offered to sponsor Hildegard. Mrs. Thornton, a nurse herself, had been impressed by Hildegard's medical knowledge and compassionate nature. "We lost our son in France," she told Major Harrison. "Helping his enemy become a friend feels like the right way to honor his memory." The other 39 women chose repatriation. Some had received word that family members had survived. Others simply felt that duty required their return, that Germany needed everyone who could help rebuild. They bore no resentment toward those who chose differently. Each woman understood that survival meant making impossible choices. On the day the transport trucks arrived to take the repatriation group to the port, the farewells in the Camp Shelby mess hall were emotional. The women who were leaving embraced those who were staying. They exchanged addresses and promises to write. And nearly every woman, whether leaving or staying, carried something sweet in her pocket. Not because she was hungry, but because she wanted to remember that even in the darkest times, there had been unexpected kindness. 20 years later, on a crisp autumn afternoon in 1965, Annalise Waldman Mitchell stood in her kitchen in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, making fudge with her two children. Sarah was 12, Thomas was 9, and neither had ever known hunger or war. They watched their mother measure sugar and cocoa with the precision she once used for radio codes, their faces reflecting curiosity about this special treat. She had married James Mitchell in 1948, 3 years after becoming an American citizen. Their courtship had been slow and careful, built on the foundation of their shared history at Camp Shelby. He had seen her at her lowest and had chosen kindness over cruelty. That choice had changed the trajectory of her entire life. As the fudge mixture bubbled on the stove, Sarah asked the question Annalise had been expecting. "Mom, why do you always make fudge?" On special occasions. Her daughter knew the basic outline of her mother's story, knew she had come to America as a prisoner of war, but the details remained largely unspoken. Annalisa turned down the heat and began to tell them. She spoke about Christmas Eve in 1944, about tasting chocolate fudge for the first time and not believing such sweetness could exist. She told them about hiding that first piece in her uniform pocket, about keeping it under her pillow like a talisman. She explained how something as simple as a square of candy had taught her that her enemies were capable of unexpected humanity. Thomas, practical like his father, asked why she had kept the fudge instead of eating it. Annalisa smiled. "Because I needed proof that kindness was real. Because after years of propaganda telling me Americans were monsters, that small piece of sweetness was evidence that I had been lied to about everything." She told them about Hildegard, now Dr. Hildegard Schroeder, working at a hospital in Georgia, about Elfrida Becker, who had married a farmer in Iowa and raised 4 children while teaching German at the local high school. The 3 women still exchanged letters every month, maintaining the friendship forged in captivity. The fudge finished cooking, and Annalise poured it into a buttered pan to cool. Her children watched the glossy chocolate spread evenly, filling the kitchen with rich sweetness. "When people show you kindness when they don't have to," she told them, When they treat you with dignity, even though you're supposed to be their enemy, that changes you forever. She cut the cooled fudge into perfect squares, exactly like the ones Corporal Mitchell had offered her 2 decades earlier. Each piece represented a choice, a moment when someone decided that compassion mattered more than hatred. Her children each took a square, savoring the sweetness without understanding its full significance. But they would. Annalise would make sure they understood that the capacity for kindness, for seeing humanity in unexpected places, was the lesson she wanted them to carry forward. Some memories, she knew, were too important to fade. Some sweetness was meant to be shared across generations.